I can still recall that day as if it happened yesterday. June 17th, 1974. A dreary afternoon in Thurston County, when the phone on my desk rang, slicing through the monotonous ticking of the old clock. The voice on the other end trembled, halting. Tom Ismay, a landowner at Millersylvania State Park, alongside two female companions, had stumbled upon something. "It's under some logs," he whispered. "A body, or what's left of it." A chill ran down my spine, not from the damp summer breeze outside, but from that dark instinct every investigator hones after years of staring into the abyss of human cruelty. As the patrol car rolled down the narrow roads into the forest, I couldn't shake the unnatural stillness. Millersylvania wasn't a place people frequented, a forgotten corner of Washington where the trees grew thick as if guarding their own secrets. We pulled up to a clearing where Tom waited, his face pale as though he'd seen a ghost. "Over there," he pointed toward a small slope, where two large logs lay stacked, like a crude tomb thrown together in haste. I approached, my boots sinking into the wet, rotting leaves, the scent of earth mingling with something sickly sweet and foul, the stench of death that had long settled into the air. When we lifted the logs, what we uncovered silenced the team. A body, or rather a skeleton draped in decaying flesh, tattered clothing clinging to bone. No face, no identity, just a shadow erased by time and nature. I knelt, searching for anything left behind. A bracelet peeked out from the dirt. A tiny pair of earrings buried beneath. Someone had tried to hide her, but not well enough to keep us from finding her. That night, in the cramped, stifling office of the Thurston County Sheriff's Department, I stared at the crime scene photos, the flickering fluorescent light overhead mocking my helplessness. It wasn't my first nameless corpse, but something about this one kept me from sleep. Was it the isolation of where she'd been found? Or the gut feeling that whoever did this was still out there, sneering at us from the shadows? I didn't know. What I did know was this: the journey to uncover the truth had just begun, and it would drag me down paths even daylight dared not touch. The next morning, the preliminary report came in. No fingerprints, no murder weapon, just scraps of clothing, some jewelry, and a body too ravaged by nature to tell its own story. Who was she? I wondered, holding the small bracelet we'd pried from the soil. And more importantly, who did this? The question hung in the air, a whisper from the darkness of Millersylvania itself, beckoning me into a case where the truth seemed forever out of reach. The morning after we found her, the air in the sheriff's office felt heavier than usual, thick with the weight of questions no one could yet answer. I sat at my desk, the Polaroids from Millersylvania spread out like a grim puzzle. Shreds of clothing, a bracelet glinting dully in the flash, and that skeletal form staring back through the lens. Under Sheriff Jack Crawford paced behind me, his boots thudding against the worn floorboards like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. "We've got nothing solid yet," he muttered, "but we'll start with what we have." What we had was pitifully little. The body was a mess. Weeks of exposure had turned flesh to rot, bones to brittle relics. No obvious wounds screamed out a cause of death. The killer had left us a cipher wrapped in decay. Crawford called in Tacoma pathologist Dr. Charles Larson first. I watched as he and his assistants hovered over the remains in the morgue, their faces grim under the sterile lights. "Female," Larson said, voice flat. "Roughly 28 to 34 years old, based on bone structure." I scribbled it down, but something nagged at me. Those tiny earrings, that delicate bracelet. Did they belong to a woman in her 30s? The confusion deepened when Dr. William Veach, an Olympia radiologist, got his hands on the X-rays. He called us in later that day, his brow furrowed as he pointed at the films pinned to the lightbox. "These epiphyseal plates," he said, tracing the faint lines. "They're not fused. She's younger, 14 to 19 tops." Crawford swore under his breath. Two experts, two wildly different answers. I felt the case slipping into a fog, the kind that swallows facts and spits out doubts. Were we chasing a ghost? Or had we just not found the right thread to pull? We turned to the scraps we'd recovered. 2 bracelets, a pair of earrings, a ring, and remnants of clothing too tattered to tell a story on their own. Crawford ordered a sweep of missing persons reports, casting a wide net from ages 12 to 50. I spent hours hunched over files, the names blurring into a litany of lost souls, runaways, drifters, daughters who never came home. Then, late that second night, a report caught my eye. Brenda Baker, 14, missing since May 25th from Maple Valley. A runaway, last seen hitchhiking near Puyallup. I circled her name, my pulse quickening. It wasn't proof, but it was a flicker in the dark. Crawford took it from there. He called the Baker family while we waited for dental records, those fragile threads that might tie this broken body to a name. I was there when Benjamin Baker walked in, a man hollowed out by weeks of waiting. We laid out the clothing, a tan corduroy jacket, a red blouse, red stretch pants, and the jewelry. His hands shook as he touched the bracelet, his voice breaking. "That's hers," he said. "Brenda's." I saw the recognition hit him like a punch, the kind of pain that doesn't fade. The dental impressions came back the next day. A match. Brenda Joy Baker, just 14, stolen from the world and dumped in that lonely park. Standing over those files, I felt the weight of it settle in. We had her name now, but the how and the who still loomed like shadows just beyond the light. Crawford said it best later, leaning back in his chair. "It's like spokes on a wheel. All the clues point to one hub, and that hub's Brenda. But the wheel's still spinning." Identification was just the first step. The real hunt was only beginning, and the deeper we dug, the more I sensed something watching us from the edges, something that didn't want to be found. With Brenda's name pinned to the body, the case shifted gears. It wasn't just about who she was anymore. It was about where she'd been and who'd taken her there. I dug into the missing persons report, piecing together her last days like a map with half the roads erased. May 25th, 1974, Memorial Day weekend, was when she'd slipped out of her Maple Valley home for the second time. A rebellious kid, 14 and restless, she'd run off before, only to drift back. This time, she didn't. Her father, Benjamin, told us she'd been talking about Fort Lewis, an army base down in Oregon. She wanted to meet a soldier, a friend had said. I scribbled it down, wondering what dreams drove a girl that young to thumb her way into the unknown. Hitchhiking. That word hung over the case like a storm cloud. Back in '74, it was common enough. Kids with their thumbs out, chasing freedom or just a ride. But it was a gamble, and the stakes were higher than most realized. Washington's highways were veins pumping life through the state, but they carried predators too, hungry shadows waiting for the naive to stumble into their paths. Brenda's friends last saw her near Puyallup, a speck of a town not far from home. 5'2", brown hair, brown eyes, horn-rimmed glasses, tan jacket, red blouse, red pants. Ordinary details that now felt like a plea echoing into the void. She'd stood there, hand raised, waiting for someone to stop. That someone did. Witnesses trickled in after we put out the call. Folks who'd seen a girl matching her description on May 27th, 2 days after she'd left. One said she climbed into a blue pickup, southbound from Puyallup, around 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock p.m. 2 men inside, faces blurred by memory and time. I leaned over the map on my desk, tracing the route with a pencil. Puyallup to Millersylvania wasn't a straight shot, but it was close enough to make my gut twist. Sheriff Don Redmond took it seriously, issuing a bulletin for that truck. 2 male occupants, he told the press, voice steady but eyes hard. We need to know who they were. I stared at the sketch we'd mocked up. Vague lines, a ghost of a vehicle. It was all we had, and it wasn't enough. The air in the office grew thick as we retraced her trail. Seattle to Puyallup was a short hop, but beyond that, the thread frayed. Had she made it to Fort Lewis? Did she change her mind? Or did that blue pickup veer off into the dark, carrying her to a grave under those logs? I walked the stretch near Puyallup myself one evening, boots crunching gravel, the hum of passing cars a dull roar. The sun dipped low, painting the sky blood red, and I imagined her standing there, small, defiant, unaware of the eyes watching from behind a windshield. Hitchhiking wasn't just a ride, it was a roll of the dice, and Brenda had lost. Back at the station, the questions piled up like unpaid bills. Who were those men? Locals? Drifters? Killers with a route they'd run before? The truck was our lifeline, but it dangled just out of reach, a phantom teasing us through the fog. I pored over reports of similar sightings, girls vanishing along I-5, their stories swallowed by the same stretch of asphalt. Each file felt like a warning, a whisper that we weren't just hunting a killer, but a shadow that knew how to disappear. Brenda's final steps had led her to that pickup, and somewhere between the road and the park, her voice had been silenced. Finding that truck wasn't just a lead. It was the key to unlocking the nightmare she'd walked into, and I'd be damned if I let it slip away. The deeper we dug into Brenda's case, the more the shadows stretched. That blue pickup was a splinter in my mind, but it wasn't the only lead pulling us into the dark. By late '74, Washington was a hunting ground, girls vanishing like moths snuffed out by a flame. I spread the files across my desk. Catherine Devine, gone November '73, found sodomized and strangled in McKinney State Park. Donna Manson, missing from Evergreen State College in March '74. Linda Ann Healy, snatched from her bed in January. Then Brenda. Each name a wound, each case a mirror reflecting the same grim question. Were we chasing one monster or many? Ted Bundy's name came up first, an itch we couldn't ignore. He was a specter by then, a law student with a charming smile and a Volkswagen Beetle that'd soon be infamous. The timing fit. '74 was his killing season, and Washington his playground. Healy, Manson, Susan Rancourt, Roberta Parks, all college girls, all gone under his shadow. Brenda was younger, a runaway, not a co-ed, but the hitchhiking angle aligned. I pictured him cruising I-5, arm in a sling like he'd played it with Rancourt, spotting Brenda with her thumb out, glasses glinting in the dusk. He'd denied it later, before the chair took him in '89, but Bundy's denials were as slippery as his alibis. I stared at his mugshot, those cold eyes staring back. Could he have detoured to Millersylvania, logs ready to bury his work? But doubts gnawed at me. Brenda's death, strangulation or knife wounds, the coroner couldn't pin it. Didn't scream Bundy's style. No blunt trauma, no trophies we could find. And then there was Catherine Devine's case. Too close for comfort. Same county, same year, same stench of violation. Detectives whispered about a connection, but the department brushed it off. No evidence, they said. I wasn't so sure. I drove out to McKinney one night, the forest swallowing my headlights, and stood where Divine's body had lain. The silence pressed in, thick and alive, whispering that these woods hid more than one killer. Then came the Black River tip. Early '75, an anonymous call crackled through the switchboard. A hunter claiming he'd seen a man in a shack near the river. Late November '73, with 2 girls, 12 or 14. He'd gone back in January, found animal carcasses, dogs, a cat, skinned and boned, scattered like offerings. The shack sat empty for weeks until he returned and saw the man again. Shots fired when he got too close. I gripped the receiver as he spoke, my mind racing. November '73 was Divine. May '74 was Brenda. Same type. Young, vulnerable. Same area, Black River wasn't far from Millersylvania. I sent deputies out, but the shack was ashes by the time we got there, torched clean. Another dead end. Another ghost. Bill Sullivan's story hit next. He and his wife had stopped at Scott Lake Interchange on I-5, May 10th or 11, weeks before Brenda vanished. A girl, maybe her, hitchhiking, climbing into a light-colored panel truck driven by a bearded man. Not blue, not 2 men, but close enough to twist the knife. I traced the route, Scott Lake to Puyallup to Millersylvania, a jagged line of maybes. Was it the same truck, repainted, a different predator? The theories clashed like storm fronts, each one uglier than the last. Bundy with his calculated charm, the Black River man, a feral butcher, or some nameless drifter, a phantom who struck and faded. I stood in the evidence room that night, Brenda's bracelet in my hand, its faint shine mocking our chaos. Bundy was a devil we knew, but the others were devils we couldn't see, lurking in shacks, behind truck wheels, in the spaces between our leads. The truth felt like a noose tightening, only we didn't know whose neck it was around. One killer or a pack, they'd turned Washington into a graveyard, and Brenda was just one star in their constellation of terror. The trail went cold faster than I'd hoped, but slower than I'd feared. By late '75, Brenda Baker's file was a stack of dead ends, witnesses who couldn't remember, leads that crumbled like ash. I'd sit in the office after hours, the hum of the heater battling the silence, flipping through reports as if staring long enough might summon a breakthrough. That blue pickup never surfaced. The Black River shack was a charred memory. Sullivan's panel truck, a half-formed ghost. We'd chased shadows across Washington, and they'd outrun us every time. Ted Bundy stayed the loudest whisper. By August '75, he was in custody, nabbed in Utah after K.L..ER slipped his grasp, hair from Karen Campbell, and others tangled in his beetle. The papers painted him a monster, and detectives up and down the coast pinned their unsolveds on him. I drove to Salt Lake once, sat across from him in '76, his smirk cutting through the bars. "Brenda Baker," I said, sliding her photo over. "May '74, Millersylvania." He leaned back, eyes glinting. "Never heard of her." His voice was smooth, practiced, like he'd rehearsed innocence for a mirror. Before they fried him in '89, he'd confessed to dozens, but Brenda and Catherine Devine stayed off his list. I didn't buy it entirely. Bundy lied like he breathed, but without proof, he was just a theory in a drawer. Then came William Cosden Jr. In '86, we hauled him in for questioning, already locked up for raping Beverly Pearson in '75, a Thurston County local. A Vietnam vet, 26 when Brenda died. He'd lived near Scott Lake, fresh off a stint in a mental ward for a '67 Maryland murder. Released as no threat, he'd proved them wrong fast. Catherine Devine's case broke wide open in 2002. DNA from her autopsy nailed him. a vaginal swab tying him to her strangling. He copped to the sex, not the killing, but the jury didn't care. I sat in on that interview, watching his dead eyes flicker when I mentioned Brenda. "Not me," he grunted, arms crossed. No DNA from Brenda's scene to test. Just clothes and jewelry, no swabs taken in '74. Sloppy work from a sloppy era. I cursed the oversight, knowing it left us blind. Cosden fit better than Bundy. Same county, same prey, young, alone, hitchhiking. Divine's body dumped 20 miles from Brenda's, both in state parks, both brutal. Detectives who'd worked both cases leaned his way. Charlene, Brenda's sister, told me years later they'd pegged him, not Ted. But suspicion's not evidence, and without a thread to tie him, he stayed a specter. I drove to Scott Lake once, stood where Sullivan saw that truck, the wind clawing at my coat. Cosden's old house was a husk now, windows dark. Had he watched from there, waiting for girls like Brenda to drift too close? The Baker family faded with the case. Benjamin's voice cracked on the phone in '76, begging for answers we didn't have. "She's still out there waiting," he'd say, as if Brenda's ghost lingered in Millersylvania. Charlene lost faith, told me in '02 the lack of DNA doomed them. I felt it too, the weight of a girl we'd failed, her story locked in a killer's silence. We'd chased Bundy's fame, Cosden's shadow, every tip from Puyallup to Black River, but the truth slipped through like water. Thurston County called it homicide, strangulation or knife, dead 2 to 3 weeks before discovery, but the who stayed a void. I boxed the file in '77, the tape sealing it like a coffin lid. No arrests, no closure, just a name and a question mark. Nights after, I'd dream of that park, logs shifting to reveal her bones, her glasses glinting in the moonlight. Was it Bundy, laughing from death row? Cosden smirking behind bars? Or someone else, a faceless hunter still roaming I-5? And the mystery gnawed at me, a wound that wouldn't heal, whispering that justice was a lie we told ourselves to sleep. Years bleed into decades, but Brenda Baker lingers. I retired the badge in '85, but her file never left my desk at home. A silent sentinel of unfinished business. The yellowed pages, the grainy photos, that damn bracelet. They stare back at me, daring me to look away. I've replayed every step 1,000 times. The logs at Millersylvania, the truck that vanished, the theories that clawed at us. Bundy, Cosden, or some drifter we never named. Each night, I chased them through the fog of memory, only to wake with empty hands and a heavier heart. Washington in '74 was a predator's paradise. I-5 a ribbon of risk, parks like graves waiting to be filled. We hunted hard, but the killer hunted smarter. No DNA, no weapon, just a girl's bones and a family's grief. I see Benjamin's face in my mind, hollowed by loss, and hear Charlene's voice bitter with resignation. "No samples, no justice," she'd said. She was right. We missed our shot in that damp June, and the truth slipped into the shadows with the one who took her. Bundy's dead, Cosden's caged, but Brenda's case stays cold, an open wound in Thurston County's ledger. I went back to Millersylvania once, years later. The trees stood taller, the air colder, but the spot felt the same, lonely, watchful. I stood where we'd found her, the wind whistling through branches like a voice I couldn't catch. Was it her, whispering for answers, or him mocking us still? The mystery clings like damp earth. Did Bundy lie to the end? Cosden kill twice, or a stranger vanish into the night? I don't know. Maybe I never will, but I feel it. The weight of a 14-year-old's trust, offered to a ride that became her end. Brenda Baker still waits for justice. Her name a quiet cry in a world that's moved on. I've stopped believing in tidy endings. This job teaches you they're rare. But I can't stop asking, what did we miss? A tire track, a witness, a shred of her story lost to time? The darkness of 74 swallowed too many. Healy, Devine, Manson, Brenda, and spat back only questions. So I leave this here, a plea to whoever reads it. Look back, think. Somewhere, in the echoes of that lost spring, the truth hides. Will it ever step into the light? That's not for me to say. But for Brenda, for all of them, we owe it to keep listening.